Hello.
How's it going?
Good, good.
Good.
Talisha, you did the tour this morning?
Yeah, that's right. I went on the tour. It was good. A little chilly, but
I know, it took me by surprise today.
yeah, I know. But thank goodness I was properly dressed for it because I put on my coat. I was like, oh, but yeah, it was very good. Shanna, who's a part of the board for the African Burial Ground, she sort of just gave a little tour of some other buildings, gave a little bit of history, um, about some other places of maybe significance
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
in the surrounding area. So it was very good.
Yeah, I
Um,
look forward to hearing more about it and hope she'll come to the task force meeting and sort of like and you and Joanne and maybe kind of do an overview of it because I like the idea how they're connecting locations. So there's like this sort of trail of historical significance and sounds cool.
yeah, exactly. And she also said she she was talking about how there's like another group that they recently sort of met with that that is capable or wants to do like a very interesting sort of um, I guess it's sort of in the virtual world,
Oh,
a
like
kind of
in situ?
no, it's not institute. It's some other organization called like Kinfolk or something like that.
Oh, cool.
And what they do is to do like a sort of virtual memorial. So like you can maybe uh, like walk down the block and be able to see like, a sign with a QR code and, sort of see something that's maybe in like a virtual thing. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've seen at some malls, they have it like this sort of walking stick figure, uh, you know, and it's like on a digital board and it's like a walking stick figure and it's kind of art installation, but then it's also supposed to be like something that tells you, where you can go, a sort of directory for like I usually see it in malls in Florida, but
Well, I look forward to hearing more as that
yeah,
develops. And Britt, are you here from Borough Hall?
I am, yes.
Okay. Are we expecting anybody else from your team from Borough Hall to be joining us?
I believe it's just me tonight.
Not just you. But okay, solo act. Uh, and then I will leave it to the co-chairs to see if you want to give it. Well, it's already 6:32. If you want to get going or give it a minute or two.
Do we have enough people to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, because there's nothing, we don't need a quorum per se, because their presentations, we're not taking any action. But I think if action does occur, we will probably have gathered up enough people by then. But tell me when, because we are not recording until you tell me to record.
maybe we give it another 2 minutes and start at 6:35 just to give people a little bit more of a chance. Is that okay?
With me, it is.
Okay.
Hi, Billy.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Uh, Britt, you're with the the same office, right? The land use. office at the Brooklyn Borough President's office?
Yes, the land use division.
Okay. Are you a director there? I'm sorry. I thought two other people were going to be joining us. So.
Oh, no worries. No, John Douglas is our director. I'm a planner in the land use division at Brooklyn Borough Hall, and I'm presenting here tonight on behalf of John.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
All right, I'm going to hit record and you can take it away when you'd like.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name's Britt Bird. I'm a planner in the land use division at the Office of Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso. Very excited to be presenting and speaking with you all tonight about our comprehensive plan. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, but before you do that, Britt, I just want to
Yes.
jump in real quick and just welcome everybody to tonight's meeting. My name is Talisha Sainville, and along with Gregory Alvarez, we are the co-chairs of the Housing and Land Use Committee here at Community Board 14. So thank you all for being here. Britt, you can go ahead and, well, I just want to introduce what we're doing here. As many of you already know, we received the Brooklyn Borough President's Planning for Public Health in Brooklyn Existing Conditions Report, which we submitted some comments to, and it should have been attached to your meeting invitation for this evening, but you can also find it on the CB14 website. And you can also go back and watch on the CB14 YouTube page if you missed the meetings where we discussed this and you want to get yourself up to date, you can always go to the YouTube page and rewatch the meetings where we did discuss this. So on February 3rd, 2023, CB14 responded to the Brooklyn Borough President's existing conditions report, and many of the comments came from a board discussion about the report and pointed out some issues that should be focused on, such as food security, heat mapping, stormwater management, transit networks, amongst other topics. And again, if you want to go back into rewatch or watch that meeting, it's on the CB14 YouTube page, which you can connect to through the CB14 website. So now, Britt, you can take it away and present to us a detailed explanation of the Brooklyn Comprehensive Plan.
Great, thank you. And apologies for jumping the gun there. Thank you for that great context. So yes, just right now, my name is Britt. I'm a planner in the land use division at the Brooklyn Borough President's Office. Very happy to be here to be in this next step about talking about our comprehensive plan for health and housing in Brooklyn. So first off, what is a comprehensive plan? The way that we're approaching this comprehensive plan is seeing it as guidance for community stakeholders in order to utilize a variety of means to implement its goals we identify in the plan. So in this context, we see this comprehensive plan as guidance for the borough president's land use decisions and recommendations, but also a way to outline and provide accountability and predictability for our land use decisions. We also see it as a great way to provide shared critical data with all stakeholders in Brooklyn. But it's also important to clarify what this comprehensive plan is not. And it's not a substitute for a citywide comprehensive plan. And it's also not a substitute for ongoing local planning efforts throughout Brooklyn. And it's not complete or finished. I'm going to want to really reiterate that throughout tonight, that this is very much a work in progress, and the back and forth and iteration is a very key, critical part of how we want to build and assemble this comprehensive plan. And it is not a rezoning itself. We're not going to be changing the zoning designations of anywhere in Brooklyn through this comprehensive plan. And it all ties back to what is the borough president's power and responsibility in the office. So at our office at Brooklyn Borough Hall, the Brooklyn Borough President's Office issues ULURP recommendations, the Universal Land Use Review Procedure. The Borough President sponsors and introduces legislation in partnership with City Council, identifies budget priorities and provides allocations. The Borough President monitors and modifies delivery of city services. And the Borough President also serves as a convener and strategic communicator and planner for the borough. So why is this comprehensive plan focusing on health and housing? The real motivation or the significant motivation of this plan is noticing the stark disparities in health outcomes as it relates to race and income in the borough. The map on the right is one indicator that shows the very big disparities. There's parts of Brooklyn where the average or the life expectancy is 20 years different, higher than others. So we see this as an opportunity to coalesce a future land use framework for Brooklyn, focusing on improving public health outcomes. And there is a growing body of research that really shows the connections between the social and economic determinants of health, such as location of affordable housing, the availability and quality of public transportation, and the accessibility to public services and amenities. These all have a very close relationship with health in our communities and in Brooklyn. So, as mentioned, we began this process with an existing conditions report. We established an advisory committee and then held a town hall in December where we solicited feedback both in person at that town hall about the data that was collected and online for a month and about the period of December and January. We presented the existing conditions to the borough board and the borough service cabinets. And we've engaged with critical stakeholders, including both community boards and focus groups that were led by our partner, Hester Street. Focus groups focusing on health and housing, infrastructure, and environmental justice in particular. So this is a collection of some examples of the feedback we received in person, and then also the online form, as well as some media describing what our goals on health and housing in this comprehensive plan. So tonight, to share with you the way that we are presenting or the way that we are organizing our recommendations. So there's two primary ways that we're organizing this plan. First is through emerging goals, where we've identified 7 emerging goals that we want to achieve or we want to strive for in Brooklyn. These are then organized into objectives and recommendations, getting more and more specific. We've also identified metrics by which we're going to be evaluating the success of these recommendations and whether we're making progress towards building a healthier Brooklyn and more equitable Brooklyn. We also are organizing this plan through land use framework, and each framework is providing a sort of spatial distribution of the priorities and these recommendations across the borough. So the emerging goals is kind of by subject area and goes from more general to more specific, and the land use frameworks are sort of the spatial distribution and organization of the recommendations in this comprehensive plan. So to go into a little bit more detail, these are the 7 examples or the 7 goals that we've identified. They span from environment to healthcare to accessibility, as well as jobs. And each one, as I mentioned, has several objectives underneath, and then even more recommendations underneath. So tonight, we're not going to be able to go through every single recommendation. We're going to be sharing with all community boards very soon a link that provides the full list, and you can give feedback on them. But tonight, we're going to go through an example of a goal to kind of outline how the plan is structured. So an example goal that we've identified is environmental conditions, where the plan wants to reduce hazardous environmental conditions in the borough, especially including those exacerbated by climate change affecting the most vulnerable in the borough. So one of several objectives within this goal is to protect vulnerable populations from high heat. Within that objective, we have 4 more specific recommendations that include increasing open space, increasing the number of splash parks in high heat communities, increasing tree cover, and the metric we've identified for addressing this problem is the Heat Vulnerability Index score, which is a metric developed by DOHMH, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So in a certain number of years, we would like to see this heat vulnerability index score decreased across the borough. So we've also talking about the land use frameworks. We've developed 4 land use frameworks that divide the spatial planning for Brooklyn. These are housing growth and parking demand management, a health and wellness economy, healthy streets and environment, and green waterfront economy, or resilient industrial waterfront is another way we've been putting this. So this is the spatial way we're organizing these sort of goals to think about how the land use in Brooklyn can be shaped in the coming years. So an example of how these interact is that we've got a list of goals under environmental conditions, and these will apply across several different land use frameworks. And the land use frameworks kind of collect a series of goals that show the different kind of recommendations that are fitting into these different areas. So the objectives apply to multiple land use frameworks, and in turn, if you pick one land use framework, you can see all of the different kind of goals that it's pulling from. So there's kind of a different way of sorting and different way of organizing the objectives that we're identifying in the plan. So to go through we also want to go through the land use frameworks with you tonight. So the first one that we've identified is a land use framework called Housing and Growth and Parking Demand Management. So this is a land use framework that seeks to facilitate transportation-oriented development, a fair share housing growth, and less congested streets in the borough. So fair share housing growth is really looking at encouraging housing construction in community districts, or especially in community districts where housing production has not kept pace with growth over the last decade. So the map on the right shows in yellow new housing that was built in from 2010 to 2020, and the underlying layer, the blue color, shows the amount of population increase. So we see that there's a large amount of housing that was built in North and Central Brooklyn, but also that is where a lot of the population growth occurred in the borough as well. You can see that in other parts of the borough, there was less housing built, but there was also still an increase in population. And indeed, no part of the borough shrunk in the between the last 2 censuses. The lightest color here just reflects the least amount of growth overall. And although we want to encourage housing growth, that's not to say that everywhere we should see growth uniformly. We definitely are encouraging transit-oriented development, that more housing growth should happen, especially close to high-quality transit stations. So within a quarter mile of subway station, we see like the highest concentration of not only housing, but also neighborhood resources, key community facilities, grocery stores, and then within a half mile, also kind of consider the residential core, where we can see strong connections between neighborhoods. And then further out, they're pursuing ideas such as encouraging accessory dwelling units, or sort of gentle density measures, even when access to transit is not as quite near. There's also many tools to address our parking demand and the amount of street curb space that we have on our streets, because the reality is that the city in Brooklyn is growing and we're not creating new on-street parking. So the goal here of this framework is to encourage folks to utilize mass transit rather than private vehicles, but acknowledging that it's going to be difficult to get people out of private vehicles if the city is not providing convenient alternatives, or the government's not providing convenient alternatives. So concentrating development along transit lines is one way of doing this, but also providing a series of other tools such as residential parking permits, better wayfinding to off-street parking, and a series of other tools to help encourage better rationalization or use of our precious on-street parking and road beds here in the borough. The next land use framework we have is the health and wellness economy, and this is a land use framework that is examining really the disparities in life expectancy across the borough. So this is a land use framework that's looking both at health outcomes and the health of residents, but also where health and education workers live within the borough. So it's looking at encouraging active and passive open space and access to medical care as care, but also as where people go to school and go to work. So as you can see, again, the life expectancy outcomes it varies wildly across the borough. So in this land use framework, we're focusing on improving access to existing healthcare and community services, but also reducing barriers to the care that does exist, such as cost, but also things such as translation services or accessibility or transit access to the healthcare that is existing in the borough. It's also about where healthcare workers work. You can see that on the map to the right, the darker colors are areas where with higher concentration of residents who work in healthcare and education industries. Roughly half of Brooklyn residents work in those two industries, and we see that significant portions of the population live in transit deserts with inadequate transit access across the borough. The proposed IBX route, the Interborough Express, presents one such opportunity to increase transit access, both to where people live and also to increase access to many of our healthcare facilities, such as safety net hospitals across the borough. Then we have healthy streets and environment. This is a land use framework that is focused on creating safe streets for where pedestrian and bicycle deaths are concentrated in the borough. It encourages us to think innovatively about the public realm, to embrace tactical open space interventions, and to prioritize bus lane construction within the roadbed across the borough. It's also about the environmental impacts of our across our borough. The map on the right is showing the concentration of PM 2.5, which is a very common contaminant from vehicle traffic in particular. It comes off of the tires, making friction with the road, produces this particulate matter that has very bad health effects. And you can see that it's distributed in different places across the borough, but particularly near the BQE corridor that is highlighted in blue. And you can see that heavy concentration of these kind of toxic waste sites and air pollution is attributing to worse health quality outcomes, especially in the environmental justice areas in our borough. And finally, there's the resilient waterfront or green waterfront economy framework. This is a land use framework that is looking to facilitate a couple things, really trying to encourage industrial job growth and retention in the borough, multimodal freight solutions, and resilient waterfront in the face of climate change. So an example of industrial job growth that we're looking to encourage is taking advantage of New York's competitive advantage in the wind energy economy. Because we have a shallow shelf, continental shelf off of the coast of New York, this makes it much cheaper and easier to build wind farms offshore. And Brooklyn's coast is well situated to be a supply chain industrial waterfront for that industry and create high quality, sustainable jobs along the Brooklyn waterfront for Brooklyn residents. The existing infrastructure near the waterfront, but also near our rail lines, also prevents some untapped opportunities to move more freight and potential last mile delivery across freight and barge modes of transit, and looking to get trucks off of the roads in Brooklyn and make for safer and less congested streets. And the final component we're highlighting here is the Army Corps of Engineers HATS project, which is a once-in-generation opportunity to perfect our waterfront communities through there's lots of small interventions they're making, but some very higher profile, larger interventions are the storm surge barrier at Jamaica Bay, tidal gates at Coney Island and Red Hook, seawalls, and a storm surge barrier up at Newtown Creek that will make a potential storm event such as Sandy much safer across the waterfront in the borough. And there's examples of how certain ongoing projects and initiatives will cut across these areas. So for instance, the Interborough Express that I highlighted earlier achieves multiple health goals in this plan. It can help reduce obesity. We can see that the concentration of high rates of obesity in the borough does cut through the area that would be served by the IBX, providing more access to a walkable train trip. It can also potentially reduce commute times, reduce car traffic, and improve air quality and access to opportunity. The IBX also goes through the parts of the borough with higher levels of vehicle miles travel reported, and there is research linking vehicle miles traveled with poor health outcomes as well. And it has the potential also to encourage residential growth, provide more mass transit redundancy, and facilitate more connection between waterborne and rail and freight movements. So for this reason, the IBX is kind of an example of a model project that is achieving a lot of the goals outlined in this comprehensive plan, both health outcomes, housing, transit, and sustainability. So where are we in the process? So the first part of the process is the existing conditions report. Now we're in phase 2 on this graphic, which we're gathering feedback. As I mentioned earlier, this is very much a work in progress. These recommendations are not finished. We are opening up to receive feedback on them. Our partner Hester Street is running train the trainer sessions with our focus groups. We're having community conversations just like this one tonight with community boards, land use committees across the borough. We will be following up with you to provide the link for the tool to provide detailed feedback, or the opportunity to provide detailed feedback for each recommendation. The next phase would be introducing the the recommendations. We're gonna have a feedback session with our advisory committee, and then having a town hall in May to have in-person feedback as well. And then over the summer, we're going to finalize the recommendations and provide a final report release. So the digital tool, as I mentioned, will be following up with all community boards, and it will be open until May 31st. And then we will also be inviting everyone to our draft recommendations town hall the week of May 15th. And would be very happy to get your feedback both in person and through the digital tool. And looking forward to any questions that you may have or any comments. And I will open it up for it now.
Thank you for that, Britt. If anybody has any questions, I think you can feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or drop your question in chat. And I guess if I can get started with my own question. So you said that, Britt, there's going to be a town hall on May 15th, and that town hall meeting is going to be to discuss basically a little bit more of what you discussed tonight, or is it supposed to be for collecting further information?
Yes, so it's going to be the week of May 15th. I think the specific day we are still confirming. But yes, the goal is that we are collecting feedback throughout April and May, and we'll be making changes and taking the comments to note, and then presenting the draft recommendations in full at that town hall, and having sort of a charrette or feedback session in person that week.
Okay, and the digital tool, what is that going to be about?
So that is a tool where we were only able to go through one goal tonight for this presentation. That tool, when you open it up, it will you'll be able to navigate it and see all of the individual recommendations through the plan organized by the goal. And there's questions asking, if there's any for feedback, if anything seems wrong, if anything doesn't seem to match your experience or your expertise of the borough, and kind of just soliciting feedback on each recommendation. And it's each field is optional, so you don't have to fill out a form for every single recommendation in the report. It's only as many as you want to, but it is a tool to provide feedback on that detailed level for anyone who wants to. Okay,
and is there a link that we can have so that we can be prepared for that town hall meeting, or is that going to come?
We will be, yeah, we will be following up shortly, like, right this week or right after this meeting. Can send that your way. Our partner Esther Street was working on it earlier this week, and it's getting finalized. But definitely, we will send it to you well in advance of the town hall.
Okay, and then I have one more question. I'm not trying to take all the air out of the room here, but uh, so the 7 goals that you've identified, did those goals come out of the first sort of phase of the existing conditions reports and all of the things, the feedback that you received? Uh, is that where those goals came from?
Yes, yeah. It came from the conversations we had in the existing conditions, the feedback, and kind of the data that rose to the top during that process, seeing the stark disparities in health and housing across the borough, just as 2 of the examples. But yes, I think that's a great way of putting it. Those goals did arise from that existing conditions phase of the comprehensive plan.
Okay. There's a question from CB14 board member Barton. He asks, what do you foresee as the main role of the community boards in advancing these recommendations and ULURPs?
Yeah, so I think I think we are looking to empower community boards to really kind of use this kind of information as they seem fit. But I think we think it's a great way to provide some predictability and reliability of how Borough Hall is going to be evaluating ULURP projects that come through our pipeline, so that community boards and other stakeholders across the borough will be able to reference this plan and know kind of where Brooklyn Borough President's Office, where they're pointing on several key issues, so that hopefully there's much fewer surprises. We know that you'll know what our ULURP recommendations and questions and hearings are going to be pointed towards, and what you can expect from our office. I think it's also an opportunity to kind of just collect and share a lot of data and resources. I mean, one thing that's become very apparent while working on this plan is that even just if you're limiting yourself to official City of New York publications and plans on things, there's just so many of them that don't always overlap or fit together very neatly, and it can become overwhelming. Even in between a single agency, there's several plans that don't necessarily overlap. So I think this comprehensive plan, I think we're hoping to make it a tool that can fit those into a more coherent and organized framework that would allow stakeholders such as community boards to easier reference and kind of identify how the city, Borough Hall, agencies are talking about key issues, what kind of stats or kind of indicators and benchmarks people are using, and kind of remove one level of, or one sort of barrier or jargon that can get in the way of planning on a more local effort as well.
Okay. I'm sorry if I'm going out of order of who raised their hand first, but I can't tell anymore, so I'm just gonna go in the order that I see the raised hands. And first up is Billy Reichling. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name.
It's Richling, but you're good. Thank you.
Richling.
Thank you for that presentation, and it's great. Any attempt at comprehensive planning, I think, in the borough and the city is fantastic. I had 2, I think, quick questions. This first one, you sort of started addressing in the answer you just gave, but maybe it's helpful to articulate anyway, is, this plan will serve as a framework for the borough president's ULURP recommendations, but obviously the borough president doesn't have sort of authority over how the land use process works or what projects come up. So can you maybe give an example of like what in practice that might look like, given that development will still come sort of in an ad hoc basis based on the market, and the zoning rules themselves are going to come from the city? Would it be the case that, like, oh, the borough president might recommend to approve a proposal based on this plan or reject a proposal based on this plan? Is that kind of when the rubber meets the road, what does this actually look like?
Yeah, I think more or less, if I understand you right, I think that that is a good example or beginning of an example. I think one example I think I can provide is, let's say there's, in the context of a ULIRP recommendation, let's say there's, a project that is proposing a change to an industrial business zone within Brooklyn, and is proposing a change away from a manufacturing land use for this site or for a part of the whole area. I think both community boards, applicants, DCP, anyone will be able to reference the plan and see that the Brooklyn Borough President's comprehensive plan says that we're looking to maintain industrial jobs in Brooklyn, and that you can have a degree of predictability that, like, because of that part of the comprehensive plan, it's unlikely that the Brooklyn Borough President's Office is going to recommend, getting rid of manufacturing land use within the borough. So I think it can provide a guidepost for that kind of process. I think the two other sort of areas we've identified for where the rubber hits the road is sort of advocacy and budget. So the plan will also kind of be a document that shows what we're going to be advocating for within the city, but maybe perhaps in Albany as well, for what policies we're supporting, what policies we want to, and what law kind of issues we want to see advanced, and then budget priorities as well. I think is the third kind of area. The Borough President's Office does have discretionary budget allocations as well, and kind of has input and oversight over the budget as well. We provide testimony at budget hearings at City Council. So identifying budget priorities is also something that will be done in the plan as kind of an implementation tool, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you. And then my one other quick question is just a process question, which is, as you continue to sort of solicit feedback, there's so much information and so many different topics in this plan, and they overlap in complicated ways. How can us as like a everyday community board member or constituent give sort of smart, meaningful feedback? Are there kind of things that the office is looking to hear from community boards or from individuals at this point that feels actually relevant or meaningful to you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm eager to share the digital tool with you because I think one way that I like how it's been designed is that it gives the opportunity to give very detailed feedback on a particular topic, but then if you don't have comments on another topic, it's an optional field. You don't have to, it's not all or nothing. So I think, and I think the letter that Community Board 14 sent to us in the existing conditions report was great. Most people did not send nearly that level of thorough comments to us, and it was really fantastic. And I think one theme that, and one line of questioning we're really trying to encourage from that phase of the process still is kind of just looking at areas where, like, does this data match with your experience and or expertise of your community and of Brooklyn? That was one big question, is that we presented a lot of data in the existing conditions report. Part of the questions was what's missing, what data do we not pull, but also like what data doesn't match with what you see or what you've experienced. And I think that question is going to remain very key throughout, because as you said, there's just so many different topics and areas being touched here, it will be really valuable to have those things flagged for us, things that don't quite add up or things that maybe flew under the radar.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Billy. Next up on my screen is Nina Sabgir.
Hi, I'm also a CV member. Anyway, I have two very divergent questions, comments. One is, has there been any look at a correlation between the many hospitals in Brooklyn that have closed in, I think, the past 20 years, and health disparity, health outcomes, because I think that's something that somebody needs to actually take a good look at. You know, St. Mary's, most recently the inpatient services at Kingsbrook Hospital, Long Island College Hospital, and so forth. And these all impact the communities where these hospitals were located. So that's question number one.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know we've been trying to examine, I think, the question of potential overstaffing or under-resourcing of hospitals. I think hospital closures is a great extra layer that we that wasn't included in that so far. We've been working with one of our partners is NIAM, the New York. Oh, I'm blanking on the Medical Association. Is helping us to parse a lot of the medical data because there's lots of different alternative measures. So we've been looking at really kind of identifying the potential measures for overburdened hospitals, and I think hospital closures is a excellent point that we can and should look into more.
Thank you. The other issue that I want to bring up, and I feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody is really addressing, and it came up somewhere else recently, is that as much as we want to get away from fossil fuels, and I think that that's an important and necessary goal, the environmental impact, particularly long-term, when we look at solar panels, when we look at various wind turbine devices, is that a lot of the materials are not recyclable. A lot of them require, mining of various toxic chemicals in and of themselves. So it's an, okay, now what do you do? 20 years from now, these batteries, or these solar panels are going to be dead. The wind turbines are being made out of materials that can't be recycled and wind up in landfill. And there's a lot of environmental impact there of a different sort. It may not be polluting the air in the same way that fossil fuels do, but it's going to have another environmental impact down the road if we don't really think through what's being used in manufacturing and what happens to these things when they've lived their life. And that and the other concern is if wind turbines are being put in the water, what's their impact on various sea animals. I'm thinking about the horseshoe crabs that come out to breed and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's it's a good point. And I think it's that kind of questions I think has been very present in how we're thinking about electric vehicles in our plans a lot, particularly with like the battery, the mining and battery impacts of creating the batteries for electric vehicles, I should say. And that, electric vehicle, while it has fewer emissions, like a vehicle is still a vehicle and poses similar kind of problems. And indeed, sometimes electric vehicles being heavier can even mean that like the friction coming off of tires, which is the main principal source of PM 2.5, can even sometimes be worse. And vehicular violence from or injuries and deaths from cars are still present and very real health risk and problem with electric vehicles. So I think that's one key area where we've really looked to emphasize decreasing the amount of vehicles on and decreasing the speed of vehicles in the borough rather than encouraging just switching to electric vehicles overall. I think that it's an excellent point to look at potential pitfalls or cost benefit of turbines and solar as well. I can't say that electric vehicles is I think the main kind of avenue that we've been pursuing that or examining that kind of trade-off or potential issues. But I will definitely take that down as something to examine as well as part of particularly the green and resilient land use framework.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Next on my screen is Chair Brown.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. So I'm going to try to sort through my many questions. Typically, when we have a presentation come to Community Board 14, it's tailored to Community Board 14. But I understand now that this comprehensive plan is a framework in which the Office of the Borough President is going to be addressing land use. But that being said, that relies very heavily on the existing conditions plan, which in my opinion, in some respects isn't complete, particularly when we come to environmental conditions, when we come to this concept of air quality. The quality of the data that you're getting is only as good as what has been studied, and the data that has been studied in, especially in the north of the borough where we have two truck routes, and then through the middle of our district where we have Flatbush Avenue, which is another truck route. That data seems inconsistent to me from what I'm seeing anecdotally, right? We have 53-foot trucks, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go into it. And then on another respect, to ask community boards to think about land use policy based on a borough-wide comprehensive plan isn't really something that speaks to locality, right? So when we sent you our letter, we sent you a 13-page table of how we would apply the social determinants of health to the comprehensive plan or the existing conditions. So what might be okay or what might work for one part of the borough isn't necessarily going to work in our district. So I guess my first question is, when you are done collecting data, when your digital tool is open, when we can actually see all of the subgroups of your goals, do you plan on looking at each community district and parsing that data further by saying, this is how we feel you might benefit from what we have discovered in our existing conditions, and what we are capable to do in our goals? Because all we can do now is look at what you gave us and then apply it to what we know about our district. And those aren't always going to work because we're looking at a borough and we're looking at a district. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think to your first point about the inconsistency of data, I fully agreed. I think the in particular with environmental quality data, definitely wish there's real lack of granularity to some of this data that is very frustrating. The many people have been asking for more granularity for like the CO2 emissions, PM 2.5 as well, differentiation between the source of contaminants, and sometimes this data, just this level of detail just doesn't exist. And one of the things we're going to be advocating for is better collection of this data, because it is immensely frustrating that sometimes this data just isn't being collected or published adequately, whether it's by the city or the state. So agreed certainly on that point. I think to your second question, I think our goal for the land use frameworks is along the lines of what you're outlining. I don't know if we're going to delineate it by community board. We can. It's definitely not ruled out. I think certainly one idea with the framework is that if you're for a community closer to the BQE, the Healthy Streets and Environment framework would be particularly applicable. I mean, I think because the adjacency to the BQE, to the higher levels of emissions, to the number of 53-foot trucks going through the area on the way to an IBZ or a SMEA, significant maritime industrial area, and then in some areas or in different neighborhoods, you would see that we've had a lot of housing growth in the last 10 years. Like the housing and parking and demand management land use framework may not be as applicable if you have been adding a lot of housing. If you see that our community board already has more than 50 residential units per acre, then that land use framework may be less pertinent to you. So that is, I think, one tool that we are definitely trying to encourage that kind of localization and local thinking. I think we've been considering whether we wanted to like delineate it formally by community board or not. So it's very helpful to know that that sounds like it would be of interest to you, or it'd be helpful to have it at that unit. Because we definitely want to kind of encourage that kind of localization and picking which parts of the plan are more applicable in different parts of the borough, because it's, yeah, absolutely true that it's not a uniform situation across the borough. Different things will be more applicable than others. So yeah, definitely want to pursue that kind of localization of how the plan would apply.
Thank you. I mean, Community Board 14 is different. I mean, you received this letter with a 13-page table, and we have a really good handle on, making an application between your data and what's going on here. And I think that if you do get to the point that you can delineate it by community district throughout the borough, it would be beneficial just in general, because then you are informing other community districts of where they are in time. We have a good idea of where we are in time. Perhaps like a little more guidance on how we would be assisted by the borough president in solving our problems. But just in general, you will find that perhaps other community districts would really benefit from that delineation. And thank you so much for your thoughtful comments.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. So next up on my screen is Carl, and then Sarah, and then Gregory.
Hey folks, good evening. So it's Alicia, thank you very much for that. And then Britt, thank you for the presentation as well. I have a question. Could you by chance go to the deck that had the, I think it had the frameworks mapped to the other items? I think it was in the beginning of the presentation.
Yes. Well, so I can go, okay, yes. I've got one, and then I've got a later slide that shows all of them mapped to each other. That would be helpful.
Yeah, that was the one. Yes, this was the one. Yeah. So basically, the question I had here was just what I'm seeing here, right? Like these were the 7 goals, and it was showing an example of them mapping to health and wellness. And so the question I had for you was, and you may have said this already, I apologize. My question for you is this just showing that for each of the other 3 frameworks, it's going to be a one-to-one, or is it possible that there can basically be many relationships between these, right? Because one of the challenges is that there are so many factors that have relationships to each other. Essentially, my question is, this goal 1 environmental conditions that maps for health and wellness, would that mean that there's also a goal 1 that maps to something similar for the green economy, right? And then in turn, as the borough president's office is thinking about that, are they looking at the situations where there's either cross-pollination or some correlation between them? That's my question. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, like in terms of like, 1.1 having 4 different applications. I think that's definitely some great food for thought. Right now, there's the kind of cross-pollination where, like goal 1, objective 1 is being applied to 3 of the 4 frameworks. So this is looking to like map how there is cross-pollination. It's not necessarily one-to-one. I think some things won't apply to every single framework, although they do apply across multiple of them. But yeah, I think this kind of mapping is meant to illustrate how it's not mutually exclusive. Like the goals and the land use frameworks aren't mutually exclusive. It's not quite as exhaustive as you're saying with the one-to-one, where each objective fits in each categories. But that is it's giving me a lot of ideas right now as you raise that, if that makes sense.
It does. Awesome. Thank you for that, Britt. I appreciate that. Yeah, and like this slide definitely helps because it showed some of that cross-pollination that you were mentioning earlier. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Sarah. I hope you're still with us. Thank you for your patience.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a staffer at the office. Thanks for your presentation. I had 2 questions. The first is the plan that you've put forward seems very dependent on the IBX in terms of envisioning what Brooklyn's future is going to look like. And so, um, how much of the plan is really contingent on the IBX becoming a reality? And is there associated work happening at the borough president's office to that end? I'm just going to give you both of mine at the same time. And the second one was you had said that part of what this plan translates to concretely is advocacy and budget. And I was wondering if it also translated to advocacy in terms of legislation beyond necessarily like really straightforward land use ULURP things, whether that is like legislation around tenant rights or legislation around sort of anything that could have to do with what's mentioned in this plan.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I think first on the IBX, we are very much encouraging the IBX. I think we're really highlighting how it kind of achieves multiple goals. I don't think the plan is contingent on the IBX. I think we're picking out as a particularly strong example of kind of reaching across several key areas for the borough. Some other corridors that kind of fit this similar kind of cross section is that, we've really highlighted improving the B82 SBS corridor that also cuts costs and provides some higher quality transit and accessibility, as well as Utica Avenue, the B46, and kind of improving transit and accessibility through all the tools that we have. I think, that's going to span across different levels of government, the MTA being a state authority, and the bus lanes requiring both work by DOT to manage the actual surface of the streets and the MTA to design the actual routes and service patterns. So I think that we're looking at every tool we can. The IBX, I think, is a particularly exciting tool that we're looking to examine. And I think it also provides a helpful lens for identifying really opportunities, but also areas that where not having careful planning would be a mistake, to be blunt. So I think two examples I'm thinking of are on the opposite ends of the line as it runs through Brooklyn. So the IBX, for instance, will bring more pedestrian traffic to Broadway Junction as the connection is going to be on the street in that area. Potentially big opportunity, not only just to provide more access to people, but also to provide better connections to existing community resources. For instance, HRA, the Human Resources Association of the City, is building a new office out by Broadway Junction. The IBX would connect more people to HRA, better resources, but if not planned deliberately, if the streets and the connections and kind of livability and open space of the area is not planned deliberately, that will really get in the way of unlocking the potential of that sort of connection. On the other end of the line, the IBX would run all the way to Brooklyn Army Terminal, which is a very exciting area of opportunity to build more jobs, maintain the manufacturing jobs that are there, and build more and provide more connections, with multimodal freight opportunities. But similarly, not having deliberate or careful planning for the future could also lead to squandering some of those opportunities. So we are definitely advocating for the IBX, see its benefits. We're not building the plan solely on the IBX, and I think we also are mentioning a lot because, kind of as I was hashing out with those two examples, it can be, I think, a good lens for identifying opportunities that we don't want to miss, and things that we don't want to accidentally box ourselves out of in the future when planning for Brooklyn. The second question, I think, about sort of implementation, I think, yes, the advocacy piece does certainly relate to legislation, and whether that means eventually sponsoring legislation or sort of using the voice and the bully pulpit of Borough Hall to encourage legislation that we want passed at the city level. So definitely not ruling that out. And the other sort of implementation measure that I would highlight, along with the two you identified with budget and advocacy, is public approvals and like ULURP and land use is definitely one implementation measure we're seeing as kind of like the three big prongs of where the rubber meets the road for this plan.
Okay, thank you. Next is my co-chair, Greg.
Thanks, Felicia. And thank you, Brett, for the presentation. Very helpful to sort of give us a framework to what to look for when the plan is released. So just a couple of questions. First, I'd just like to echo Chair Brown's comments in terms of helpfulness for us, particularly for future land use actions, since we ourselves will be framing any decision, any decisions on recommendations in a district, construct. That I think that would be helpful for us moving forward. But related to that, my first question. So you had mentioned that the Borough President's office is going to be using this document as their framework for weighing in on future land use actions. Does that also then apply to community boards where, in terms of our recommendations that we will be preparing, do you foresee the Borough President's office expecting to see that sort of language and that sort of framework when we present our recommendations to you, in any sort of action that we see?
No, I think it's more about providing predictability for our rationale and our decisions. I don't think it's going to be dictating or expecting results from each community board. I think it's just, providing more transparency, predictability, and accountability for our ULURP recommendations, both so applicants, community boards, other parts of the process will know what to expect from us. But also, if there's an instance where there's a project coming along, then you can look at a previous precedent, you can look at the comprehensive plan and say, well, according to the comprehensive plan, this recommendation should be something or that we expect from this recommendation, and this is not what happened. I think we're looking to kind of encourage it as an accountability and transparency and predictability tool for us, rather than dictating or expecting things from community boards.
Okay, but does it behoove us, I'll say, to since you're going to be framing it in this fashion, for community boards to likewise think about their decisions in that framework?
I think we would certainly not turn anyone away from considering these recommendations in their recommendations for sure. I think we want to share what language we're using, how we're thinking about these plans. But yeah, I don't know. I can just say that we're not looking to dictate community boards' ULURP recommendations for them for sure.
Okay, and then secondly, because sounds like we will have a comment period for a period here, but it is rather aggressive considering I think what the size of this document may look like. Because I guess we'll be, we're under a month already to when that charrette town hall may occur. So do you envision this document to be a so-called living document, so that, as time progresses, that, in terms of changed circumstances, in terms of additional data, that there will be opportunities to amend and update as needed to keep it applicable to current conditions within the borough?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I think so. I think it's been an iterative process throughout, and I think we will be looking to update it as needed, even after its publication.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Brown. You have another question?
Yes, well, just thank you for recognizing me again. I think Mr. Alvarez brings up a really great point. The digital tool is going to open on May 31st. Community boards go into hiatus in June. So it would be really amazing if the Borough President's office can think about it not only as a living document, but in commenting on the digital tool, perhaps we have phases, right? Because you're only giving us 30 days to effectively to look at the document, to comment. And you know how we operate here. I mean, we look at everything very critically. So we're not going to respond to you in 10 days. So to have it in phases, right? To think about, we're going to have phase 1 of comments, phase 2 of comments, and perhaps just bring it through to when community boards come back in and perhaps close in November. But you don't want to wait for all this data. I know that you want to keep working, so phase it out, right? So give us a month for phase 1, and then perhaps working throughout the entire summer and then fall, just so you are effectively getting the best of us. And I just want to thank Mr. Alvarez for bringing up this concept that, there is a very small window and it should be a living document. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that I think phases is a great way of putting it, a great idea. I'll definitely carry that forward and we can get back to you.
Okay, thank you. And the last question for Britt is Elizabeth.
Hi, yes, I came from a doctor's appointment, so I'm a little late, but I perused through the slides on from the YouTube as I was getting off the train. I saw that there was talk of not creating more street parking and using transit-oriented development to try to get us towards more sustainable modes. I was wondering if there was anything in the draft recommendations about removing I know it's not something that the borough president can just do, to remove parking minimums from new buildings as well. To create the option to build a greener, fewer parking spots to reduce the demand for cars more there. And, if there is a need for cars, of course, people would still be able to, create those parking spaces if they see fit. But knowing that this often really, the forced parking creates increases in rent overall because it's space that can't be used in the building in other ways. And being in a housing crisis, I was just kind of wondering if there was any consideration to that in these recommendations. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Happy to say that eliminating parking minimums, I think, is among one of our recommendations. We do recognize that it is it's a factor that drives up the cost of construction and housing and makes it harder for it to be more affordable to rent at more affordable rates, makes it harder to build, and also induces presence of cars in our streets. So that is definitely one area that is present in our recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And thank you again, Britt Bird, for being with us tonight. I think we're going to move on to the next presentation that we have for this evening. So we'll be hopefully speaking with you again soon. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and for answering all the questions that
Great. Thanks so much.
I'm
going to put my email in the chat.
Great.
If anyone has any questions.
All right. Greg, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to echo. Thanks again, Britt. Very, very helpful for us tonight. Okay, so we'll move on then to our second agenda item tonight. We have with us William Couch, one of our 2022-23 FCNY Planning Fellows, who has been working on a project specific to our district regarding affordable housing inventory. So he is here tonight to present his findings and what we can take away and move forward with this new fountain of information. So at this time, I'll turn it over to you, William, and please, by all means, if you'd like to introduce yourself before we start, that would be great, and then lead in to your work for us. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen here. I'll get that going. Are you seeing the slide?
We are.
Okay. Great. So yes, thank you all so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, have a chance to speak with you today. So yeah, my name is Bill Couch. I am, as you heard, one of the community planning fellows for the past the 2022-2023 year. I'm also a graduate student in public administration at Baruch College. And I have been looking into housing within Community District 14. And so I'm working this into working hard to get a report finalized and together to you all to have essentially provide a reference document for you with some data on housing, both the current kind of conditions and the recent developments, trends that you can see from some of the data. So today, I'd like to just touch on some aspects of what I've been finding as I've been looking at data for housing within the district, and then see what questions you may have. And yeah, so this was just a good opportunity to get a chance to speak with you all ahead of the finalizing this report over the next several weeks, and hopefully what comes out of it is a document that will be useful for you to reference as you consider your district needs and consider land use issues within the district going forward. So kind of the areas that the data and the information is trying to touch on are listed here on this slide. Really, it's about looking at, as I mentioned, trends. So what's been happening, the diversity of the housing stock, the availability of different levels of different price levels for different income levels within the district, different apartment and house sizes for different size households. The affordability, and looking at the affordability programs was one of the impetuses that was around from the start of this project. So that's a component of it as well. And then the capacity is something else that's trying to take a little bit of a look at to shed some light on, as just sort of how built out is everything within the current zoning? Are there, where is the opportunity or potential to expand housing looking ahead to the future? So that's the project. So I will try to get through all that and without talking for too long, as I have a tendency to sometimes do. So I'll try to be efficient here. So first off, just kind of straight numbers. District has just under 165,000 residents and 62,000 and some change housing units. Looking at that as of the 2020 census, the increase in population was about 2% since between the 2010 and 2020 census, which is less than population citywide, which I think you saw actually in the previous presentations. Looking at one of those maps they had, the district hadn't seen quite as much growth as some other areas in the borough and across the city. And the housing units were actually up about 3%, so a similar number as the population. The images I included here, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the housing types you have a lot of in the district, but there's quite a few of these kind of medium density rental or co-op buildings of 6 stories or so, and then also quite a large areas of more single family type of housing units, low density. And overall, the housing stock is on the older side, with 80+% dating to before 1960. So from the affordability programs, I think, as you've heard from city planning presentations before, one of the ideas of the mandatory inclusionary housing, which came about after 2016, had to do with economic diversity and promoting economically diverse neighborhoods. And this graphic was from a report leading into the passage of mandatory inclusionary housing. And in that, city planning categorized neighborhoods by whether they were concentrations of lower income, concentrations of higher income, or more even distribution, and put the arrow in here indicating this line here is Flatbush and Midwood, and this whole group is was those deemed to be kind of more even distribution of income, so a more balanced income, not heavily skewed to one end or the other of the income spectrum. So this was from a report in 2015, looking at some more recent data, kind of updating that, still within Community District 14, still have a fairly even distribution, and not heavily skewed to any one band of income distribution here. So this is up through data up through 2020, and the median income then was just a small amount under the citywide median income as well. So a fairly economically diverse district. And looking from there, though, at and how that the affordability of apartments and the rates being charged for rent within the district. There's, this is kind of what essentially I wanted to point out with this table here is for the end of the income spectrum that is at the lower end, a relatively small percentage of units within the district rent for at levels that are affordable to kind of these very low income, extremely low income bands that are 50% or less of the area median income, because that can be a little abstract. I tried to just as an example what those levels are along here at the bottom for a 3-person household. So this is these lower two bands are for a 3-person household based on the area median income for that 3-person household is around $122,000 as of 2022. So this kind of 50% and under is under about $60,000 for that 3-person household. And so relatively few rental units in the district are affordable at that level. And that's not uncommon, unfortunately, within New York City. The rent burden levels here, you see at the bottom of the slide, has a little bit over half of households pay more than 30% of income, which are the kind of federal HUD level threshold for being considered rent burden. And then out of those, 30% of households pay 50% or even more of their income, which is a level that tends to be deemed extremely rent burdened or heavily rent burdened. And that's a little bit higher than citywide, I believe, but not totally out of line with what's common in New York City, where housing is expensive. Looking at some trends in affordability. This is looking at some rental data for the median asking rents based on data from StreetEasy. The dashed blue line here that you see running across the top is for Brooklyn as a borough. And then the other 4 colors of lines here, which are all generally trending pretty much in the similar trend. Those are by neighborhood: Flatbush, Midwood, Ditmas Park, and Prospect Park South, so neighborhoods within Community District 14. And I think one of the takeaways from this was over this span, which is 2012 to 2023, so about 11 years worth of data, still the kind of median asking rents are a bit lower than the median value for Brooklyn as a whole. However, the gap has been closing somewhat over this time period, where it was closer to initially more like 60% roughly back in 2012, and has risen faster in neighborhoods within Community District 14. So compared to the median across the borough, so more about 80% of that median. And as you note, just the very recent trends, and this is everywhere, is that kind of since that small dip at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, since 2021, there's been a fairly an increase pretty much everywhere over the last couple of years. So within Community District 14, there are about a little over half of the units are rent stabilized, and looking at preserving affordable units, and then the next slide will be about production of affordable units. There has been about 500 affordable units that have been preserved under various programs since 2014 and through 2022. In the preservation is mostly this tax program that's Article 11, which is operates with nonprofit housing development fund corporations doing that work, and you can kind of see the distribution is most of those units have kind of been between very low income and moderate up to moderate income level. And then production of new housing, new affordable units coming from different sources. So what to point out here? So overall, just to note that between the 2010 and 2020 census, there's that 3% increase in housing in numbers was about 1,800 units. The count by the city of affordable units created since 2014 housing plan is about 900 total created. That does include some that are still in construction. They may not have been completed in construction just yet. So there may be a slight, may not be exactly, it's about half of that 1,800, but there's a little bit of variation in what's counted in those two. So not a perfect comparison, but then, and out of those affordable units, 319 are from inclusionary housing programs counted in there. And then just to note that from these different programs, this 420C, which is specifically for developments using low-income housing tax credits, produced some at the extremely low end or deeply affordable as the typical term of art there for affordable for lower income bands, and some of these other programs tended to create, especially 421A, which is a tax break for creating buildings that have some percentage of affordable units, created the most affordable units, but they were at the middle income level. So that is actually kind of either side of the area and media income. So that is like 80 to 120% of or actually all the way up to 165%, I think, of the area median income. And so they're not, so the affordability level is sort of in the middle and not at the lower end from those programs. So that's a significant number of units created. And I'll mention 421A a little bit again at the end of later in the presentation. So just to keep that in mind. So some of the data I tried to look at also specific projects within Community District 14, a few here that, as you know, I'm sure that you haven't had a district-wide rezoning that would include make mandatory inclusionary housing required just generally. So there's relatively few projects within the community district that have been subject to mandatory inclusionary housing requirements for affordable housing, but there have been a few rezonings based on with the MIH requirements. The Caton Flats project had the highest number, was 100% affordable, has the highest number of overall affordable units that were added, and that's so out of that 319 number. That project alone accounted for 255 of those units. And that was a project that used this Article 11 tax incentive and for development, or tax exemption for development by a housing development fund company. And you can see the income distribution that those, or the levels of affordability within that project. So there are a significant number of those units are for moderate and middle income, or affordable to moderate and middle income households. And oops, sorry, didn't mean to quite advance that yet. And a smaller percentage at the lower end, and then a couple of projects here that are had rezonings approved that are have market rate. So the green here is the just market rate, non-affordable units in the project, and so the actual affordable units are percentage there, and those are, both of those projects had ones that would be in the low income or very low income bands of income levels. So that rounds out kind of the inclusionary housing. So moving from there, just before I get to the end here, the last thing just to touch on briefly is some of information about just the current zoning and capacity for expansion of housing within the district. And so let me zoom in here. I think I can zoom in a little bit to make this maybe more readable to everyone. But this map is just of the zoning within the district to kind of see areas. So your floor area ratios for residential zoning within the community district. The lighter shades are low density zoning. So you have significant areas of essentially single family only zoning, kind of in the southeast, and then through these pockets going up towards the north end here, including kind of these blue outlines are the historic districts there. And then obviously this area towards the northeast here with some more medium density in these corridors of medium density residential zoning. And so there's a significant amount of or number of the lots within the community district are zoned to the lowest density zoning at 0.5 or 0.75. That really is primarily just single family zoning. And you can see just with the table here is just pointing out that lowest 0.5 FAR zoning accounts for over a third of all the lots in the community district, and then another 15% on top of that. So getting to about 50% at either 0.5 or 0.75 density zoning. So, and so that's essentially zones R1 through R5 in the zoning. So fair number of the lots zoned to the lowest density. And then there, let me zoom into this map as well. But this was taking a look then at the amount of that zone density that is actually currently being utilized by existing residential uses. And so in this, a fairly large percentage represented by the gray here is built over or up to at 100% of its zone capacity or over. And the lightest, this kind of yellowish cream color, is also fairly close to its at 75% to 100%, so fairly close to its maximum zoned floor area already. And then relatively fewer lots are kind of underutilized or utilized only a small percentage of what they are zoned for in terms of residential area, and back out here to look at that in terms of the table. We're looking at about over 60%, about 60%, 61% of lots are 75% or more of the floor area that they're zoned for. They are already using, and you know, in the under 50% of the lots that are actually residential, only 13% or so are 50% or less of their maximum area. So limited capacity in a lot of on a lot of properties to expand any additional density in housing. So just kind of coming to the end of what I wanted to at least present to you, and then I'll go to the questions on the next slide. But just a couple things that I wanted to mention as things that kind of occurred to me as looking ahead with as I get this report to you and you have a chance to look at it and reference it. What are some of the things that occurred to me to be thinking about, or maybe that would be useful to think about for the future here? One of those things is just, especially from the last slide, is how might growth be achieved in housing growth, given the capacity or the built out capacity in the district already. Would there be zoning changes needed if you were looking to allow additional housing or additional density, or could it be done within existing parameters? I think we just saw from the presentation on the Borough President's Comprehensive Plan that obviously something that's being thought about at that level of talking about transit-oriented development and distribution of building everywhere. I think I saw on one of those slides. Another example of that is just you know, the New York State Housing Compact that the governor has put forward. It doesn't sound like these targets are going to go through if the state does eventually pass a budget, which I know which is a couple weeks late now. It didn't sound like they were going to include this, but at least it was proposed in the governor's plan that targets of something like 3% housing growth over a 3-year period for downstate suburbs and in New York City. So by comparison, the community board or community district saw about 3% growth over 10 years versus a 3-year period previously. So so that might be worth thinking about. And I also, you know, another driver of this I just kind of saw this week, and so grabbed this graphic here as a study from that came out from Pew, looking at housing growth versus rent growth, and kind of making the point that a lot of the data they were seeing in certain areas, that places that had more housing growth saw less rent growth, less growth in level of rents. So seems to be more research and data coming out saying things like that, which may be cause to at least think about how you might be able to grow in the future. The other thing to mention is just from one of those slides I mentioned, some of the affordable units created under the 421A program. To note, as you may already be aware, that program expired last June. So projects that hadn't started their foundation work as of last June currently won't be eligible for that program anymore, which allowed tax exemptions for a period of time in exchange for providing a certain percentage of affordable units. It is also used quite often in inclusionary housing to help make those projects with affordable units pencil out. So there are a number of arguments both for and against. It sounds like everything I've heard about the state budget negotiations, it sounds like that won't be coming back, at least in this year's state budget, even though there have been some advocates for it. I think there's also been some opposition. So that with that program, no longer being in effect, and also J51, which deals with preserving some units, affordable units, it might be worth thinking about how does that affect financial viability of affordable housing production within the district, and what would that, how does it affect that production, and what would that mean for affordability overall in district? So a couple of thoughts on things to think about in the future, and potentially future areas to explore. Okay, so hopefully I didn't talk too long there, but thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Great, thank you very much, Bill. I think this is all important data that we'll definitely be using into the future. So at this time, certainly if there are any questions of Bill based on his presentation, we'll entertain those now. Just raise your hand and I'll call you in the order they appear. So why don't we start with Nina? By all means, please ask your question of Bill.
I don't know if this is so much a question as an observation, but one of the, when you talked about how there really hasn't been such a big population growth within Brooklyn, I would venture to say that there may be more of a population shift. And one of the issues that confronts, many families, particularly within the Orthodox Jewish population, which we have a large number of here, is that as families grow, finding a place to live becomes more and more difficult, and being able to afford what little there is becomes increasingly difficult. Most apartments that are being built, you use the three person in the family model. And we're talking about families that may have 10 or 12 or even more people in the family, being a mother, a father, and the kids. And there's just nothing being built. And so that's driving a lot of people into the situation of saying, well, they can't find anything they can afford. They can't afford to buy. And so they are simply moving out of the area, going upstate or to other, even to other cities, because they can't afford to stay in Brooklyn and have, breathing room. So that's just an observation on my part. I think that something that needs to be considered in terms of housing that's being built are the sizes of these units realistic relative to the needs of the community, and is there a need and a way to make more affordable housing that also can accommodate larger families? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And yes, I definitely agree. In a piece of this that hasn't always been good, easy to find a lot of data on, but yeah, the breakdown or the cross section of sizes of units to accommodate a variety of household sizes is an important aspect, I think, and I agree totally with your comment. So thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Our next question or comment or etc. Sean Campbell, our district manager.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for this work, Bill. It's been a pleasure having you on board. It's sort of an embarrassment of riches that we've had 3 great planning fellows this year, but I was really eager for this data because it is, very practical. We're going to be using it as we move forward with district needs statements and housing recommendation decisions and stuff like that. Kind of piggybacking on what Nina alluded to, when we talk about population growth in this district specifically, even if we hold the district static over time, because we have a higher percentage compared to Brooklyn-wide and citywide of severely overcrowded units, I think that might also be, something to sort of parse out. When we still, even if our population didn't grow a speck, we still needed more housing from the get-go because of the severe overcrowding in so many units. And then a quick shout out to to Community Coordinator Sarah Skla, who's been doing some work on gathering data about our housing code violations, or in serious housing code violations, when we talk about overcrowded and rent overburdened, and then also substandard rental units in the district. It again sort of underscores the need that just isn't being met super quickly. So just to suggest maybe additional backdrop to some of these figures as you finalize the report. And then quickly, you might not have it now, but I wonder if the zoning and housing capacity percentages that you presented, if you have a borough-wide or citywide comparison. So when we look at our potential for development under current zoning regulations, we know how that compares in broader context. And thanks again for the great work.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. And yes, to answer the question, I don't have right in front of me the data, but I do have the data on that can compare that to to put it in context. And so there are several of those data points, including, and I'll make sure I include that point about the zoning. But there are several of those types of data points that I want to or do have that data for the city and borough wide to give comparative points, because I know as we've talked, I know seems like that's something that's useful for you to be able to compare to other community districts and across the city, to be able to say, oh, here's how we compare, here's where we rank compared to other places. So I've tried to make sure to include some reference points there. So
appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you, Sean. Okay, our next question comes from Elizabeth. So please proceed with your question.
Hi, thank you so much, Greg. Thanks so much for this presentation. I had just 2 questions about kind of relating again to the population growth. One was just, do we know if the city generally, where, areas where there was more population growth, if it was correlated to increased housing capacity, or if it was more correlated to overcrowding? And second, I just also wanted to note that we are missing kind of I think, and to Nina's point, we do seem to be missing sizes between small apartments and large homes in our district. Like, there's less stock in that from my understanding. But I've also noticed that many of my peers and other young folks in the city have had a lot of trouble finding a small housing from their own. So so just wanted to to note that there might be a balance. I don't know if there's any insight or data on how many of the maybe more family size units are being taken up by more young professionals living together because they don't have other options where they can maybe live alone, potentially, versus if there's just more demand, versus if there's, if it's, families entirely just taking, if that trend has changed over time, just to get a better insight of what kind of housing units, we're missing, because it might be, I could see both, I've seen both of these issues. I've both seen families struggling to find a large enough unit. I've also seen, single people having trouble finding a small unit just for themselves, and then taking what, they otherwise would consider a family unit. So just didn't know if there was any additional data on that you might have found. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. I don't know that I haven't found that I know of off the top of my head that would differentiate whether these are the people in the household are related individuals, it's a family unit or relatives, or whether it's maybe just roommate types of situations, and what percentage of those there are in different units. I'm happy to try to take a look and see if I can find that data, because I definitely understand the point, and then that would be an interesting data point to have. I agree. So I'll look for that. And then, sorry, the first, remind me the first part of your question again. Sorry.
It was just if you know, it sounds like we had a smaller population growth than the rest of the city. Was that in other parts of the city, were they building more units where there was the larger population growth, or was it just more like, was it more of an overcrowding issue? Because I know that, you know, our neighborhood, our areas, it has overcrowding issues, and also has maybe seen less development than some other parts of the city, which have had a lot more development. And so I was wondering if the population tended to move to places with more development, or if it was just increased overcrowding elsewhere.
Yeah, I think there may be some of both, I think is probably the answer. I think there are certainly a number of areas where there have been much more significant growth in housing or development of new housing. And so those areas did tend to then see more population growth. And I'd have to look at the actual overcrowding piece of it to see on measures of overcrowding how that stacks up. But my gut instinct is there's probably some of both going on, that there are some areas that saw both an increase in overcrowding and some more just greater development of housing that correlated to increased population.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. The next person on the list is Chair Brown. Please.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for doing this work. It's really going to inform us for years to come, and we so very appreciate you and what you've done. And then just to preface what I'm going to say, I respect your academic timeline. And so anything I'm going to suggest is just about, you know, food for thought, things that perhaps will inform the project, or for you to for it to inform a future project of yours. So considering I have to echo unit size, especially in the affordability range, it is an issue. 1640 Flatbush Avenue is an excellent example of unit size. We heard this in a public hearing. I'm not sure if you watched those tapes. We do have all of the floor plans, and you can see a disparity in what's being available in the affordable realm versus the market rate realm. And then just as a sidebar, in terms of quality, all of the affordable units that face Flatbush Avenue, all of the market rate units for the most part face Aurelia Court. So a case study on something like that would be very interesting. Again, respecting your academic calendar, that would really sort of highlight the size differential. The other thing that I love to think about in a study like this is, in the discussion, you offered 2 questions as part of your discussion. But I would love to see, like, shoot the moon, what would solve this problem? And the problem is quite vast, right? We're looking at land affordability, we're looking at labor, we're looking at materials. All of those things culminate into what is the rent roll going to look like in a building. So, you know, if you shot the moon and thought about the most innovative ways you can solve problems in terms of construction, or making units more affordable to build and to rent, that would be really interesting. I mean, you know, it doesn't have to be really anything that's realistic, but just, you know, the seeds, you know, thinking about this discussion aspect of what your project is. And these, in terms of looking all of the things that I saw, these are things we can probably do better, because if we don't have 421A anymore and we don't have J51, there might need to be some kind of subsidy somewhere in the process, somewhere in the pipeline. So these little ideas, you know, sort of lead to legislation in the future. Again, respect for your academic timeline, just throwing some ideas out there. And I just, again, really want to say thank you so much. This is a great project.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the comments. And yeah, those are both interesting points that I'll put some thought into.
Yes, thank you. And we have one more question, and then one more question in the chat as well. But first, we'll go to Carl with your question. So please, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Greg. And so definitely I want to echo everyone's thoughts. Bill, thank you so much for this. This is very thorough, and it's definitely a lot to chew on, and there's deeper levels. I have a question for the group. And so, Bill, one of the slides that struck out to me was the one where you had the percent breakdown of basically what can be built. And, you know, it basically showed a large percentage of stuff was like 70% or greater built out, right? So there wasn't much space. Like, I can recognize Brooklyn College as one of the spots that's not residential. And so the thought I had for the group is as housing becomes more of a crisis and more severe, I was wondering, as a group, does this mean we should be touching base with you know, the 7-0 and other tenant organizations or any housing groups? Just because I've read articles over the years of people who go to homes and they finagle their way into having those homeowners give up their deeds, right? And so I'm just looking at this stuff and I'm just thinking, in the darkest timeline, I look at this and I go, if there's a way for me to swindle a group of people out of their homes and them not even realizing they've given me the deed, then that would mean I would have the right to buy up those lots and do what I need to, right? So it's nefarious thought exercise, and I apologize, but it's just I'm looking at this map and I'm just thinking, if there really is no place to build, then in a dark timeline, an alternative is for me to find a way to steal what people own. And once I steal it from them, then I can do what I want. And one of the things that I could do is then build, you know, some big lot and charge whatever I want. That's it. Just food for thought.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, I mean, I, you know, was sort of curious as well with sort of, you know, looking ahead, maybe not necessarily in the nefarious vein, but just in terms of, you know, based on what you've seen in the trends over the course of, you know, looking, I guess, back to the last 10 years or so, if you do see any potential, you know, trends that may continue within our district, that would be interesting to me to see if you see anything there, particularly, you know, in relation to utilization, and then even perhaps in, you know, potential rezonings that might come our way. I don't know if that's something you necessarily could see based on the data, but, you know, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. And again, subject to the caveats that Chair Brown mentioned as well. Okay, I did see one question in the chat. It's from Sarah, and she says, do you have any sense of how many units have been removed from rent control, i.e. affordable status, over the past 10 or 20 years? You know, you mentioned that the preserved units, so I guess the question would be the inverse there.
The answer is I don't know off the top of my head, but I do have some data on that that I can look back to and provide. But yeah, that is something I have about. There is some data out there on. I think it's not perfect data, but there is some data on number of units that have been deregulated and lost rent control or rent stabilization. So, yep, I can provide that data.
Okay, appreciate that. Yeah, I see that both Michelle and Joanne, you put some further information in there about the point that Carl made. So it's certainly an issue that's worthy of continuing monitoring. All right, so I don't see any further questions. So I think if there's nothing further, we will thank Bill again for all of his hard work as part of this report, and we look forward to the final version when we see it shortly. So thank you so much again, Bill. This has been great work, and we're definitely going to be using this for years to come.
Great. Yes. Thank you all. I appreciate the time tonight. And yes, I'll hopefully be getting that report to you in the next several weeks here as the spring semester and everything wraps up. So
thanks, Bill. And be in touch with the office if we can be helpful, of course.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'll just, I guess, circle back to Talisha and I guess for the wrap up, because I think we're complete for the evening.
Yep, that's all for me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And
Thank
see
you
you
very
next
much.
time. Bye.
Good night, everybody.